Kennedy here with Evan New and Jamal Carnett, and we're doing a Tech Teardown storyline recap for the week of Friday, November 1st. Facebook reported earnings on Wednesday, and shares were on quite a roller coaster ride in after-hours trading, as well as the following day. The stock briefly reached an all-time high of $58. What were some of the highlights of Facebook's third quarter earnings report?
So kind of like last quarter, the real show stealer this time around was mobile. Mobile percent of ad revenue is 49%, which is up from 41% last quarter. Dollar terms, that comes out to about $881 million. So Facebook's almost doing $1 billion in quarterly revenue on mobile now, which is a huge ramp, especially compared to a year ago. They were at about $150 million for the same quarter. Mobile users are now up to 874 million. They're really just executing on the mobile plan.
So it sounds like it was a pretty good report, but Facebook shares started to give up some of their gains during the conference call, and some people are blaming the CFO for a very particular comment. What was the bad news here?
Well, yeah, the stock sold off after the CFO said two things. Number one, they would increase the ad load in the news feeds. And number two, they also noted that user engagement was slipping amongst the younger teen set. If you think about it, Facebook's an advertising model. The way that they're going to grow revenue is they're going to either grow users, they're either going to produce more ad feeds or more ads, or they're actually going to be able to charge more for those ads. If any of those things don't fall into place, it could be a potential risk to the investment going forward. So that's why the stock sold off after the comments.
How do you feel about social media stocks? It seems like maybe they're not for the faint of heart.
Yeah, I mean, social media is getting some pretty frothy valuations in general right now. I think in a lot of ways, those are justified because these companies have a lot of potential. But at the same time, any company that trades at really high multiples is always going to be very volatile. And there's been a lot of concern recently about teen engagement on Facebook, which is why this one comment, as well as the ad load comment, people are getting scared that teens are going to be shifting away, and maybe Facebook will be a fad. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think Facebook is that critical mass.
All right. Research firm IDC just released new tablet and smartphone market share numbers. Who's winning and who's losing in the market share wars here?
So on the smartphone front, smartphones hit a new record this quarter in terms of global unit volumes, 258 million. IDC notes that price points continue to fall, in part largely driven by Android vendors and low-cost markets, really going after these low-end markets. I think we're seeing China continues to be the biggest market, and the Chinese players like Huawei and Lenovo are really jumping up the rankings.
What stood out to you in this report?
Well, I was looking at the actual tablet side, and the outstanding performer on the tablet side was actually Samsung. It reported 123% year-over-year growth and shipped, and its market share went up to a little bit over 20%. Apple currently seems to be the biggest loser. It's actually reporting year-over-year growth over a little under 1%, and saw its market share drop from over 40% to under 30%. So remember, this is before the iPad product refresh, so we want to see those numbers going forward. But right now, Apple appears to be the biggest loser this quarter. Finally, Microsoft wasn't broken out here. It was kind of listed as other. Well, going forward, we want to see how the Surface line actually puts a dent in the overall tablet market share.
What's the key takeaway for investors? There's a lot of numbers we just went through. What matters about this? So
on the tablet side, I think Apple's going to come back in a big way this quarter with the new iPads. The Google's doing pretty good. The Nexus 7 got a nice little boost for ASUS. Shipped about 3.5 million units as a gain of about 1.5 million from last quarter. On the smartphone side, I think again Samsung and Apple are still kind of on top, but they're both starting to finding it harder to grow because they're both so big at this point, and that's also true for Samsung.
All right. Let's talk Intel. It's common knowledge that Chipzilla has missed the boat when it comes to mobile, so far. But now Intel has announced commercial availability of its first multi-mode LTE modem. For the layman, explain what that is.
So Intel already launched an LTE modem earlier last year, but it didn't support these older 2G and 3G networks, which you need to be able to do to include in all modern smartphones, because they still need to fall back on these older networks when LTE is not available. So that's what they're doing now. Is this new modem will include all these different modes, and it's the XMM7160. It's a model number. No one's gonna.
So Qualcomm has traditionally dominated this space. Do you think Intel has a shot at challenging them here?
So this modem does look competitive in terms of what it can do, but the real problem that Intel's going to run into, which is a problem that pretty much every baseband player right now that's trying to challenge Qualcomm is running into, is still just this lack of an integrated solution. Because right now Intel's selling this modem that's going to be paired with an Atom processor, but it's still a discrete part, when the market has really put a high value on integrated modems over the past couple of years. Qualcomm is still the only person that's shipping this, and they are still enjoying this advantage.
How might Nvidia fit into this picture? I know Nvidia has a release coming up.
Well, yeah, they do. They're actually preparing their first integrated LTE chip, the Tegra i4, a little bit next year. It's slated for a Q1 launch, and also they currently do have the Tegra 4 plus the Icera i500. But right now, that it's not quite integrated, so this is going to be a good step for them going forward. The business has had a rough year. They've actually been basically transferring from the Tegra 4 to the Tegra 4i. But they're still going to beat Intel to the market, and it should be a really interesting battle going forward.
This is a really crowded market, isn't it?
It is, and I remember earlier this year, Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang on I think a February conference call, he very specifically said, there is no standalone modem business anymore, and in many of these 4G connected device marketplace, an integrated approach is necessary. So he's very much acknowledging this. I mean, obviously he's exaggerating a little bit, but it's still very clear that everyone that wants to get in this space, whether it's Nvidia or Intel or
What about Broadcom?
Broadcom, exactly. Broadcom too. They all need to have an integrated approach. Otherwise, OEMs are not going to be putting their chips into these smartphones.
All right, let's check in with Google. After months of leaks and rumors, Google has officially announced its new flagship smartphone, the Nexus 5. It has a lot of meaningful upgrades over the Nexus 4, right?
It does. I think the biggest one here is the LTE. As far as other specs go, it's going to a 5-inch display. It has a Qualcomm Snapdragon 800 chip inside, very powerful processor, and it has the newest version of Android 4.4 KitKat, which will eventually make its way through the rest of the system. But yeah, the big thing here is LTE, which last year, the Nexus 4, the biggest omission was LTE, but there were a lot of technical and political reasons why it wasn't there last year.
Let's talk about carriers. Google traditionally has, or in the past, Google has relied on T-Mobile. Has that changed at all?
Well, actually not. The details are still coming in, but right now, Sprint and T-Mobile are the major carriers. Sprint's actually jacking up their price to around $450 retail, and are actually going to offer it about $150 after a $50 rebate. T-Mobile, the pricing hasn't been announced yet, but obviously that relationship is going to continue. Noticeably absent were the major carriers, AT&T, Verizon. They basically stated that it would work on AT&T's network, but no official announcement. And then also Verizon, we don't know what's going on there. Could this be a little blowback about Google's foray into the internet service provider industry? I don't know or not, but it's interesting that those were noticeably absent.
What's the point of Nexus? It's not a big seller. How is it this meaningful to Google? Why do they keep pursuing it?
So the Nexus 5 already is sold out of the first batch, which is seemingly a good sign because it's already shipped to slipping to 2 to 3 week shipping times. Now that looks good, but remember this exact same thing happened last year. But last year it was really just an issue with low supply, and there were all these reports that LG wasn't making enough. So it wasn't like it was a blowout. I mean, there's demand for it, but it's not like some huge, crazy, game-changing volume player. Nexus still sets the bar for Android, really kind of Google reminding everyone, hey, we will make devices if you can't, and if we have to. Their hardware sales are going up, so Google's other revenues category is up 85% last quarter to $1.2 billion, and Nexus is included in that.
All right, let's turn to one of Google's arch rivals, Apple. The iDevice maker has been vague on a specific launch date for the new Retina iPad mini. Of course, that won't stop the rumor mill from churning. What's the latest possible date that you've heard?
So this is kind of a very shady rumor, but it's something to kind of...
Where'd you hear it?
So people have seen Target listings, like a product listing on an internal database on Target or something, which I don't think Target usually gets access to this type of information ahead of time, but it could still turn out right. But they're saying November 21st. iPad Air launches this weekend, and that would put the Retina Mini about 3 weeks later.
How is the iPad Mini with Retina significant for Apple? I mean, the biggest revenue driver is the iPhone.
That's right, but I am starting to worry about this a little bit. If you looked at the last quarter results, what really missed was actually the iPad. I think they sold 14.1 versus expectations of 14.5. Of course, that was due to the iPad not having a refresh. So that could be one of the reasons why. But investors are going to want to look for a very strong quarter from iPads on, of course, the Q1 and the December quarter. In addition, we also want to make sure that if they don't have the product, sales could possibly be pulled for future quarters. We know IDC is already stating that iPad is losing market share. We want to be sure that Apple can get these products to customers as soon as they can.
Between the Retina Mini and the iPad Air, do you think one or the other is more meaningful for investors?
I think that we're going to start seeing demand shift back towards the full-size segment with the iPad Air. I think there's going to be a pretty good turnout for it, especially this weekend and this quarter. I still think it's incredibly important for them to produce enough of these Retina Minis because that's where a lot of demand is going to be. I've even seen reports now that Apple is going back to Samsung for more displays, where previously they're going to LG and Sharp, but Sharp's having problems, so they're going back to Samsung now, even though they've been trying to cut out Samsung. But Samsung still makes really good components, so it's really hard to cut them out entirely.
Now, Apple has been trying to shift focus away from unit market share, an area that Samsung overtook long ago. Instead, Apple has been focusing on other areas, such as customer satisfaction. But it looks like Samsung just edged Apple out in this department.
So J.D. Power, which Apple has touted and really bragged about, it has a string of like 9 wins of J.D. Power and Associates awards for customer satisfaction. So it's very proud about this. And you're right, they've been trying to move the conversation away from unit market share into other things like usage, customer satisfaction. The J.D. Power's latest award goes to Samsung by a slim margin.
Can you explain some of the criteria so we know how Apple's being judged, as well as Samsung?
Right, so J.D. Power looks at primarily 5 different categories. They look at performance, ease of use, design, features, and cost. And the interesting thing about these ratings is that Apple actually beat Samsung pretty easily on 4 of those categories, except for cost. So Samsung does go for lower prices, and that which in theory creates greater value because you pay less, you get more.
Right.
But so Apple's getting dinged because they're priced at a premium relative to Samsung. But it's just kind of interesting that that one category is seemingly allowing Samsung to pull ahead overall.
What do you think that means for Apple investors?
Well, this kind of points to a good enough tablet market. Look, Apple beat Samsung in 4 out of the 5 categories, as Evan mentioned, and still basically lost. In a way, this is kind of a microcosm of people that are bearish on Apple. Will Apple be able to maintain premium pricing against Samsung, against Google, against Microsoft? Or will they actually have to start cutting prices and sacrificing margins to keep their market share high?
All right, let's move on. In a fun turn of events for Microsoft critics, InfoWorld reported this week that Microsoft is doing sneaky things with users' search history, a move that Microsoft famously accused Google of doing. Can you kind of explain the basics of what smart search is?
So Microsoft has been on a really aggressive ad campaign against Google over the past year or so. We're saying people are being scroogled since Google sells your data to search advertisers. But Microsoft is now basically building this into Windows 8.1 in Bing Smart Search. The big difference here is that Bing Smart Search will actually use your local searches on your computer and then send all that information to Microsoft and Bing, and then Bing, Microsoft will again use all that for its search advertising. Search advertising was up 47% in last quarter, so they're making progress on this front. But this is kind of just a weird, a little bit hypocritical here.
What do you make of Microsoft's move here?
Well, I actually liked the Scroogle ad campaign in the past. It was basically Microsoft accentuating their positives versus Google. Google derives the majority of their revenue from search and search advertising. So being able to tailor that to an end user's past or prior history is actually a positive thing. However, Microsoft, of course, makes their money through software, so it wasn't as concerned. However, this is a little bit hypocritical. Now, in the short term, I think Microsoft has kind of figured out, or what everybody's figured out, that privacy doesn't seem to be as big of a concern with users as advertised. They may be able to monetize Bing, and it seems like they're doing a little bit better job monetizing Bing going forward. So this may help Microsoft, rhetoric aside.
This seems like just another reason for consumers to hate on Windows 8.1. Because as we know, the rollout went really poorly. Do you think this is like crossing the line, since it's so invasive, it's actually searching your private computer?
It is, but I guess a lot of it's going to depend on how aware consumers are that this is going to be happening, because this is not going to be a big headline event. I mean, we've seen some reports on it now, but most of the headlines out there are just saying, oh, Smart is really integrated, and the experience is better because really integrating a search on a deeper level to the operating system is going to be useful for actual users, but at the same time, they might not know what's happening behind the scenes, and that will really determine if there's any backlash.
All right, that's all for today on Tech Teardown. Want to learn more about the tech stocks we're investing in? Just send an email to cto@fool.com, and you'll receive our special free report on our Chief Technology Officer's favorite social stock. For Evan New and Jamal Carnett, I'm Erin Kennedy, and we'll see you next time.